Hey there, and welcome to another episode of my show. I am Father Roderick, and I'm recording this on a very, very hot afternoon. It is 29 degrees Celsius here in my studio. I've got my headphones on, which means that my ears are almost melting off my head as well. But that won't stop me from bringing you another story, another show. I remember first time walking into this arcade. I was about 9 years old, I think. And I'd never been to an arcade. This is something that I wasn't even aware of existed, but I was mesmerized because I loved computer games. But the only computer games I knew about were the ones that you could play at the local snack bar, where you get your French fries and your fried food. And every once in a while, we would order some French fries for the family there. And I always would love to go there and pick it up and ride my bike back home with the warm fries, because while we were waiting for our order to be delivered, I could watch this machine, this arcade machine, on which they would have different games every month. And so the one game I remember very clearly was this game where you would fly a little aircraft, or a bomber aircraft, I think. And below you were big skyscrapers, and you had to drop bombs on the skyscrapers, trying to level them before. And every round, your plane would descend a little bit more, and then ultimately it would fly very close to the ground. So you had better level all those buildings before you reach that ground level, and then it became more and more difficult. Now, of course, I didn't have money to play that game, but it had a demo mode, so I would just pretend I was playing that video game. And then over time, those games became more advanced, and at one point, of course, they had Pac-Man, which everybody was playing at the time. And I just loved video games, and that was the only place where I could see them. But this day, I was walking into this arcade, and the entire place was filled with arcade machines. They were everywhere. The whole building was kind of darkened, and they had these fluorescent lights, and it looked all very kind of futuristic. And you would hear the sounds of some of these machines, the little bleeps and music. There was a machine that played almost like an animated movie. It was called Dragon's Lair, and it was, at the time, one of the most advanced video games available, because it was using a laser disc, which was totally revolutionary technology. And so you would be able to guide this knight who was trying to free a princess and had to face all sorts of obstacles, and ultimately also a fearsome dragon. But the cool thing about that video game was that since it was an animated, it was all animated footage that came straight from a disc, and it was only at certain moments you had to press a button or move the joystick in the right direction in order to go to the next level or the next phase in the story. It looked fantastic. All the other arcade games in that hall were super primitive because they were running on relatively old computer hardware, whereas that for me was the future. I mean, I was dreaming that maybe one day we will have video games like that everywhere. And I spent there hours and hours just watching other people play. I did, however, have a budget to play some of these games myself. And the reason was that our parish priest was Father Perquin, had come along, and I was there not by myself, but we were there with all the altar boys and acolytes of our parish. Every year, he would hold a collect for us because he wanted to thank us for our volunteering as altar boys for an entire year. So he would ask the parishioners to give us some money, or to give him some money so he could give it to us. And then he would take us to this amusement park. And the amusement park itself was nothing like, I don't know, Disneyland or Universal Studios or something like that. We didn't have that kind of amusement parks in the Netherlands at that time. So this was kind of more like a very big open park with all sorts of play gear for kids. But for me, the big attraction of that amusement park was this arcade hall. And I was just it was magical to see all these screens and to hear all these sounds and to see all these video games. I was like, this is the best place in the world. And our priest would give us, every hour we could come up to him and he would give us 2 guilders. At the time, the currency in the Netherlands was called guilders. And you could divide them into 4. Each guilder was 4 quarters. And a video game, to play a video game on a slot machine, on a machine like that, it was 1 quarter. So every hour, I would have these 2 silver-looking coins, which then immediately, of course, I traded in for quarters. And it meant that I could play 8 games, or at least I could play 8, let's say, rounds, because, of course, these games were progressively more difficult. And so I was extremely picky. I was always studying other players and see how they advanced. And I remember the first game that I actually spent money on was Qbert. Qbert was this very funny alien, and his snout was like a trumpet, and he would be on top of a pyramid consisting of colored blocks, and it looked a bit 3D. Of course, it's fake 3D because at the time computers couldn't do real 3D. But he would hop down this pyramid, and you had to hit certain surfaces, and they would change color. And I don't know exactly how the game worked, but it looked fun, and it wasn't too difficult. A lot of the other games were very much based on reaction speed, and I felt like if I play games like that, I'm going to be, it's going to be over in 1 minute, and I wanted my quarter to last. So after studying all these different games, now the quest game with the knight was very expensive because it was so high technology. That one cost 1 guilder per game. So there was no way in the world that I was going to spend 4 quarters on just one video game. So I played Qbert, and then I would go and make another round and just spent hours just thinking, how am I going to spend my money? And I was so picky that at the end of the day, I would actually have a lot of quarters left, which I didn't spend. But it really it made a huge impact on me, those outings, and we did them several times. Like, I've been an altar boy for, I think, 11 years, if not more. From the day I did my first communion, that was when you could become an altar boy, until I was 18 years old and I entered seminary. So that is actually, that's a little more than 10 years. So let's say 11 years. And I think at least 3 or 4 times we went to this amusement park. And what I really liked about the whole experience was how cool our pastor was. Our parish priest was generally very, very good with kids. He always spent some time at the end of his homily to do a summary of his homily for kids. So everybody would be asleep because he wasn't a very good preacher. He was a bit, I would almost call it lazy. So most of his homilies were just a retelling of the readings that we heard without much added to it. He would just kind of rehash the readings. But for kids, he actually made some effort to tell a story or to put in a joke or something like that. And we loved it as kids. It was like, wow, this priest is talking to us. We matter here in the church. And he consolidated that image that we had of him as this very benevolent priest who was very fatherly towards kids during those outings, where he would be this benevolent source of these coins that could give us a fantastic day. And I think one of the reasons that we all, as kids, loved that priest so much was that he was the ideal father figure. He was someone who made sure that he spoke to us. He paid us attention. He gave us these coins so we could have a wonderful day. He wasn't into any of that, but he would just sit and have a beer or a cup of coffee with the sacristan and some other people that came along. But when we came to get more of our coins an hour later, he would ask, so what did you do with it? And did you have fun? And that's great. Here you have 2 more guilders and go have fun. And it was in a certain way. We all knew, of course, that priests would lived a celibate life and didn't have a family, didn't have kids. But we were like, oh man, we wish our parents were like that. Isn't this the best? And at home, I would beg for like, can we please get an Atari? What was it, the Atari 2600? Which some of my friends that had rich parents actually had. They had these game consoles at home. And I begged and begged and begged, and no, my parents were absolutely not going to give us a game computer because according to them, it was not good for our development, and we had better spend our time studying and reading books and playing outside, which I knew that the moment I would make my own money and I would have an income, I would not waste my time going to play outside. I would just buy an Atari and play video games. And lo and behold, 42 years later, that's actually what I do. When I want to have a good time, I just I launch a video game and I play like on the Xbox. Or I love video games, and I think that love started there thanks to that parish priest who enabled us to have that wonderful experience. And the strange thing is, even though he was such a great father figure, when we told these enthusiastic stories about how much we loved this priest, my parents were baffled. And they actually said, well, but he's not at all like that. No, how can you like him so much? He is very unlikable. And when he is with us and we're in a meeting or whatever, he can be so grumpy and so entitled and impatient and stubborn. My dad told us that at one point they had a meeting with him and he didn't like the conversation and he just turned around on his chair. He literally turned around so he would be with his back to the rest of the parishioners, and he said, I am not only going to turn my chair back until you do what I want. So my parents like, how can that be the same guy? It was really someone with two personalities. To kids, he was super kind, whereas towards adults, he could be extremely difficult to handle. Later on, I heard stories about the parish vicar that was assigned to him, which he didn't want. He felt that it was actually almost an assault on his independence, and the diocese didn't take him seriously enough. He was totally capable of running that parish by himself. But anyway, he got assigned a parish vicar who had to live in the same rectory. And the parish vicar later on told me that it was not a good time. He was not at all kind or supportive. He was extremely stingy, so he wasn't allowed to prepare his own food. He had to eat what the parish priest would eat, and then every morning he had the right to get 2 slices of bread, only 2, which the parish priest would then take from the fridge, from the freezer part of the fridge, and he would put them in a toaster, and that was breakfast. And just the whole stinginess kind of matched the rest of his behavior towards the parish vicar. So I've always kept that in mind. Like, you may know a person from one side, you may see one side of that person, and that might be very genuine. I don't think that our parish priest was like playing a role or pretending to be kind. No, he actually really enjoyed giving us a nice day and to make us feel great. But when he was among adults, he would just switch behavior and he would be annoyed. And I don't know, maybe as kids, we weren't a threat to him. We weren't critical. We all loved him. And of course, if you feel loved, then it's very easy to be kind. Whereas if parishioners have problems with some of the things that you do, or wants changes in the parish that you don't agree with, it's much harder to be kind and generous and to, be open and listening. Now, these father figures I think in all of our lives remain very important. These and not all fathers are equal. They don't all behave in the same fatherly way. In fact, this is something I became aware of when I started to work as a priest, and people would tell me sometimes that they had trouble praying the Our Father, because it made them think of their own father, who wasn't really a very good father, and they would have traumas and everything, and that made me more sensitive to the possibility that someone's image that they have of God as a father may be troubling and a bit complicated, because the fathers that they knew in their life didn't really inspire something that you would attribute to God. They would be sometimes even more comfortable calling God a mother, because they would have a much more affectionate relationship with their mother. But if I also met people who had trouble with the devotion, the Catholic devotion to the Virgin Mary, because they had a troubled relationship with their mother, and then considering Mary to be this celestial mother that takes care of us, it just didn't compute, because they didn't have any personal experience with a mother that was anything else than critical and dangerous. So it goes to show how important it is to realize that there's not just one type of father, there's not one type of mother, and the duality that you sometimes have in people was something. So the fact that I started to see that my priest actually had two ways of behaving, one very kind towards children and very, very awful towards adults sometimes, it was something that I also recognized in my own father. My father died this past week on Thursday. He's going to be buried on Tuesday. I'm recording this on a Sunday. And as I explained also in my other podcast, The Walk, I had a good relationship with my father, but I'm also very much aware that my father had two sides. One public side, very kind, very humorous, good storyteller, and in many ways, I think I resemble him quite a bit, especially in kind of my love for telling stories and kind of upbeat nature. But my dad also had a much more serious and less perfect side, especially when he was stressed. And he would never show that to the outside world, but in our own family, in the family dynamics, in the relationship with us, his children, he could be extremely harsh and emotionally distant, and he would lose his temper in very unpredictable ways. And there were other behaviors too that were, totally the opposite of who he presented himself in public life. So that a father can have two sides was something I was very familiar with. And I think that this relationship that we have with our parents has long-lasting experiences. And if that relationship is particularly troubled, it can also cause trauma. It can really damage people, and that hurt and that the trauma can have negative effects until very late in your life. You can struggle with like hearing the inner critic is oftentimes the voice of your parents, who might have been very critical towards you, or for who it's never enough. And so I've shared a lot of my own thoughts and also my own growth in that respect, and understanding how I was raised and how much that impacted me and in which way. And I think one of the things that I inherited of the way I was raised and of my relationship with my father was that after leaving the house, I've always been looking for substitute fathers. I was always looking for new father figures. And as a priest, of course, that seemed to be actually not difficult at all, because after all, we call priests fathers. We work under the responsibility of a bishop, who is not someone who just pays us a salary to do work for him. No, he's supposed to be kind of the head of the family. And the church has always been defined as a family. And so I would project this need for a father figure in my life onto the bishop, or onto anyone who had a superior position, like, for instance, a president of the seminary. And the other thing that I've realized is that not only I was doing this in real life, looking for father figures, and in a certain way also for father figures that would be different from the father that I had experienced, fathers that could be like that parish priest who was just kind and nice to us and not critical. But I was also looking for father figures in the stories that I read and watched. So in books, in movies, in TV shows, and the books and movies that I loved the most featured father figures that in a certain way idealized or were idealized versions of fathers and people that I could picture having as a father for myself. One of the books that I have read time and again as a child, and which was my all-time favorite book, and still is to a certain extent, is Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory, or Charlie's Chocolate Factory, as it was called in the Netherlands. And, you know, the story, this kid who lives with his grandparents finds a golden ticket, and with a whole bunch of other kids, he gets to visit the most magical place on earth, which is Willy Wonka's chocolate family. And Willy Wonka initially presents himself as a father figure who takes care of these kids and brings them to all these different places in the factory. And what we don't know, we discover this later on in the story, is that he's actually looking for a successor. He's looking for one of these kids to be the heir to his empire. And so he needs these kids to have certain qualities. So what you start to realize when the story progresses is that it is actually a selection process. These kids are there without knowing to audition for the role of taking over the chocolate factory. But as a child, I wasn't really aware of that subtext. What I loved is to picture this guy who is fantastic and who's got, like, his factory looks like an amusement park where the rivers are filled with liquid chocolate and you can eat everything. And they've got little squirrels that are opening nuts, and then those are the hazelnuts that you find in your chocolate bars. And it looked like a fantastic place. They had like a shrinking machine or a television, and you could become so small that you would fit in a television. I love those stories. It was so imaginative. And then Willy Wonka, I was like, wow, I wish I had a father like that. You know, it's just, I knew it was an imaginary story. And it's only later on that I started to see, well, wait a minute, there are two sides to Willy Wonka. There's his public persona, who is this magical, always happy, cheerful, funny guy. But then there's also this shrewd business guy who can be very harsh towards these children. And there are some scenes in there. And I actually realized this much more when I saw the movie version of the book, where some of these kids are punished so severely for their mistakes and their missteps. And even towards Charlie, who for me was the hero, I totally identified with Charlie. And then to see that Charlie and his grandfather are almost kicked out because they made one tiny little mistake, it was a totally different Willy Wonka all of a sudden. So same thing, a dichotomy between the good father figure and the harsh, critical, merciless father. Later on, another story that really touched me, and I still love it so much, is the first book of the Harry Potter series, where when we meet Harry Potter, he is an orphan who is part of this Vernon family, and they treat him so horribly. Uncle Vernon is just so evil and so abusive. He is a total caricature of how someone can completely throw away his responsibilities as a substitute father for Harry. And then later on in the story, Harry gets to meet Sirius Black. And first he's afraid of Sirius Black, but later on he discovers that actually Sirius Black is his godfather. And that becomes a real father to Harry, who still misses his parents that he hasn't known, of course, because they died because of Voldemort. But Sirius Black is someone who takes Harry seriously, who encourages him, who takes him as he is, and also teaches Harry courage to be strong, even though Sirius Black himself is impulsive and can be a tad bit too adventurous. And ultimately, isn't able to protect Harry because he's killed. And so he, in a certain way, fails to be the father who's always there for Harry. But this whole transition from a very bad father, Uncle Vernon, to this idealized Sirius Black, who is like this great guy, it helps us to grow with Harry in processing his traumatic youth or childhood, and then to discover that ultimately, you have to move on, even if your parents had their flaws. You have your own responsibility, and Harry over time grows into this very good leader who, yes, has a lot of faults and makes mistakes and isn't perfect at all. But nevertheless, he is good. In his heart, he is good. He's courageous, and he stands up for his friends and wants to protect them and lead them. And ultimately, the story ends with Harry Potter himself becoming a father. In the very last scene of the last book, he is a father of kids himself, and I think he is probably a very good father because he has seen both the example of an extreme example of what a bad father how much a bad father can hurt children, because he's experienced that himself, and also how valuable a good father is who is there for you. And so I think that experience is extremely valuable for Harry Potter the moment he becomes a father himself. We also have, of course, the Star Wars story of Luke Skywalker and the father figures in his life. You've got, on the one hand, these authoritarian father figures like Uncle Owen, who's very much like my parents when I was young, and having to navigate kind of my ambitions and my dreams and my hobbies and this exuberant creativity that would often take the place of my duties, and then their own. Like, they felt like, but rules need to be respected, and we need to make sure that he doesn't waste all his time with his friends playing computer games. And so when the movie came out, I totally identified with Luke, and I hated Uncle Owen. I was like, oh, come on, let him be. Just you're curtailing Luke. And Luke Skywalker in the first movie is, he's submitting himself to that. He dreams of joining Starfleet Academy. No, not Starfleet Academy. That's a different genre, but a different franchise. But he wants to become a pilot, and he dreams about a life that is bigger than that desert planet Tatooine. But when his uncle tells him, "No, I need you for the harvest," he is resignated to stay there, and it's only because his substitute parents, his uncle and aunt, are murdered, that he then follows this new father figure, who is Obi-Wan Kenobi, and is able to move on beyond the restrictive attitude of Uncle Owen. Now, the tragic nature of the story is, of course, that he very quickly loses that newfound father, Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's so wise and can teach him so much. And before the movie is over, Obi-Wan Kenobi is killed by Darth Vader, and Luke is screaming, "No, this shouldn't happen." And you wonder, how is he going to process this? This must be so traumatic. And in Empire Strikes Back, you see that Luke is still struggling with the loss of these father figures. And when he ultimately confronts Darth Vader and hears that Vader, the kind of the incarnation of evil, is actually his real father, it also crushes this hope that he had that, well, my father was a famous Jedi, and yeah, he may be killed, but I can still uphold this image of, and I can imagine who he would have been. And then he discovers that, no, actually, this guy who I believed killed my father is my father. And what does that mean for me? And you start to really fear for the future of Luke. Is he going to choose the same path as Anakin? Is he also going to hand himself over to the dark side? Which all comes to a close, of course, in Return of the Jedi, where this confrontation, and this is part of the hero's journey, where you have to confront your father and somehow kind of figure out who are you and how are you going to move on, and what impact does that father have on your life and on your choices and on your future. And this is where Luke has to make a choice. And the Emperor knows this, and he knows how troubled Luke has been in the past, and he tries to use that against Luke by saying, you just step in the footsteps of your father. And Vader himself had already told Luke, follow me, join me, and together, that's the temptation, we will rule the galaxy. And Luke has to refuse that because, yes, it's his father, but no, he doesn't share those values. He has a totally opposite value, so he chooses to plunge himself into the abyss rather than joining this authoritarian, abusive father. And it's ultimately in Return of the Jedi that Luke makes a new choice when he starts to see, well, wait a minute, this Emperor has been manipulating my father, and now he's manipulating me, and he may actually also go after my sister. And that is when Luke decides to, no, I have to. This is who I am. I am a Jedi like my father. And he talks, of course, about Anakin and not about Darth Vader. He says, I want to define myself as the good part of my father that I believe is still in there somehow. And it may not come out, but I know that there is goodness in my father, and that's who I want to be. I want to be a good Jedi like my father. And that breaks the walls around Anakin's heart. And from Vader, he turns back into Anakin, and he acknowledges that he has a responsibility as a father to protect his son. And he does that by sacrificing himself and killing the Emperor until, of course, the sequels came along and somehow Palpatine returned. But we'll not talk about that. But anyway, it's something that all goes through my mind now that I have to say farewell to my own father, who had these two sides, a very good side and also a very bad side. And both sides have had quite an impact on me, just like, my whole relationship with my parents has had a massive impact on who I am, and has impacted me in a good way and also in not so good way. But it's ultimately up to me to decide what will define me. Who am I? I'm not a copy of my parents. No one is. You are not predetermined. It's not your fate, as the dark side always tries to lure you into believing. It's not your fate to be to copy everything that your parents did. You are you, and you can choose. This is what I define as good and as values of my parents that are my values. And I choose to be that father figure, or I choose to be motherly in this way. And as for my own father, I think it's important to be realistic. And I'm always very careful when I hear about other people losing their parents, because you don't often know the entire picture. But what every one of us can do is to go over who these parents have been for you or are for you, and then say, well, but this is what I recognize. And when I think of my father and how he impacted me in a positive way, I'm definitely thinking about his humor, his incredible curiosity, his interest in history and Celtic culture and music and all that, and his sense of humor. And yeah, I know that was only part of who he was, and he did have another attitude as well. But that's in the past, and that is for him to come to terms with when he's facing his creator. But it's up to me to move on with what I want to retain. And that is what I wanted to share with you today. In a way, I love how Star Wars continued with the story of Rey, who is in many ways the opposite of Luke Skywalker. She has never known her parents, and she doesn't really need a father figure. And when Finn is trying to play the father figure, let me rescue you, she's like, I don't need to be rescued. I can take care of myself. And yet you see that in her heart, there's also a certain void. She longs for connection, not necessarily parents, but she doesn't want to be alone. And that is how she connects so much with the other members of the resistance. That becomes her new family. She chooses to be, in the end, actually a very motherly figure. And I think that's how they are going to continue her story arc, that in this movie that they're going to make or are already making, she will be the mother of a new generation of Jedi. And it's going to be very interesting to see how she will define herself. And that is what I love about these stories. They always show us that, you may have had terrible father figures or terrible parents, but ultimately a good story ends with the protagonist, the hero, choosing his or her own path, learning from the past, taking from the past what is valuable, and leaving the rest behind. That is what I wanted to share with you on this episode of my podcast. I hope you like this. Make sure also to take a look at my Patreon page if you want to get the premium version of this podcast, in which I talk about way more stuff. There's going to be a lot more content in that. And so if you join my Patreon community, even if it's just for the lowest tier, you will get those these premium shows delivered straight into your personal feed that will work in your podcast's application. So anyway, that's just my little plug. If you want to support me, go over to patreon.com/FatherRoderick. Just go to patreon.com/FatherRoderick. There will be a new story next week, so talk to you then. All right, so that was the first part of the show. So this is going into the public feed, and now I'm going to continue the show with what will end up in the premium feed. So for those of you that are watching this live, you actually get like a preview of what my patrons get in as a thank you for their patronage. So let me go and take a look at my notes. Here we go. So I'm going to cut this out, of course, obviously, in the audio version.
How do you not like movies?
They're predictable. Like, the guy gets the girl, and that kid sees dead people, and Darth Vader is Luke's father.
Not liking movies is like not liking puppies.
They're fine. I just get bored and never make it to the end.
You need a movie education. You need a movication. I'm going to give it to you.
It was another glorious week in television. Oh my goodness. Ahsoka? Star Wars Ahsoka, that show is getting better every episode. And I think next week's episode may actually be the highlight, the best episode of the season. One of the indicators is that they are actually going to do a very limited theatrical release of that episode, which usually is an indicator that they want to enter that particular episode for the Emmys or for even the Academy Awards. It needs to have a limited theatrical release to be able to join. I'm not sure if the Academy Awards actually do television. I don't think so, but definitely the Emmys and some other contests, they need to have this theatrical release. But I think it's an indicator that next episode is going to be really, really good. And I can see how, because in the fourth episode, they do something that is so incredibly cool. And it solved a question that has been lingering in my mind ever since I went to London earlier this year in April. And we heard that we would actually see the return of Anakin Skywalker in Ahsoka. And at the time, we knew that Anakin had made an appearance in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, but it was very limited. You had that one flashback scene where we literally have a flashback of the time that he was still training with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and that was wonderful, but it didn't really feel as a return of Anakin. Because obviously, at the time of the story of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin has already turned into Darth Vader. So how can you possibly magically turn back into the Anakin that we know and love? So that was a very good solution to have a flashback, and then to have like this one almost like dreamlike hallucination where you see him standing in the background somewhere. And then of course you had that final confrontation between Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi, where Obi-Wan realizes, well, you know what? Actually, Anakin is truly dead, and what remains is just Darth, and that's it. So when we heard that Anakin would return in Ahsoka, I was like, well, are they going to do another flashback? I mean, I would be fine with that. That would be wonderful, but it feels a bit redundant. They've done that for Obi-Wan. They can't keep on doing that. There must be another way, and they were just hinting at something different. And now we know, because in this 4th episode, I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it yet, they have such a creative way to bring him back. And it's only at the very last moment of the episode. So it keeps you on the edge of your seat. Like, how? What are the implications of this? And if you haven't seen the animated show, Star Wars Rebels, you may actually be even more confused, because the way in which they bring Anakin back has to do with a very revolutionary concept that they introduced in the last season of Star Wars Rebels, which added a dimension to the Force that I think is congruent with the way that George Lucas set up the whole concept of the Force, but at the same time, visually and narratively was so different from anything we'd seen before. And now they're bringing the same concept to the live-action series. I think they did a tremendous job. I do think it may be very complicated for people that are not aware of what happened in Star Wars Rebels. So I'm really glad that I caught up with Star Wars Rebels before I started watching Ahsoka. But I think that it's probably in the next episode they will give us a little bit more explanation for those that don't understand what's happening. But it was fantastic, and the entire episode was fantastic. What I like is that the main characters all have a very specific character arc, which also, thankfully, is not all positive, in the sense that we see Sabine making a decision that is very consequential, to say the least. And I think it's courageous, because it could completely upend the plans of Ahsoka and the rest of the rebels. And at the same time, you totally understand why she makes that decision. But how are they going to resolve this? What will be the consequences? It is amazing. The bad guys in these episodes are also very interesting. There are these two kind of not really Jedi, but definitely, like, there's this one former Jedi and his apprentice. And they too, there seems to be more to them than just being these mercenaries. That's how they present themselves in the first episode. But there is more to that. And what's going to happen to them? You keep thinking, this is not what I expected. Even Ahsoka herself is very different from what I expected. She's not the cheerful, kind of bouncy, girly woman that you saw in the Clone Wars and in Star Wars Rebels to a certain extent. Now she is almost too serious. She's very, very non-communicative. You even feel like, well, maybe Ahsoka is also struggling with things. She is not the perfect heroine. No, she too has problems, and there is a fallout between her and Sabine, and we haven't had any information about the severity. We did get some hints in this last episode, but it's. I think it's going to be very interesting to see if Ahsoka too will need healing. That would be, I think, very Star Wars-like. That even Luke Skywalker wasn't the perfect hero. The only main character that we've seen in the Star Wars movies that actually stays the same and doesn't really have a very particular story arc is Rey, and some people don't like the fact that she seems to be so always good, always on the right path, incorruptible. How realistic is that? And in Ahsoka, definitely, I get the idea that most of the people, most of the main characters, do have some issues, mother issues, father issues, and they need to heal from that. And that makes it relatable. The good stories are not about perfect people because we are not perfect. So we like to see ourselves in the story and to see that people can actually grow despite maybe the wrong choices that they make, but despite the trouble in their life. They can outgrow that. They can make different choices, and that makes us true heroes to us. Real heroes are people that have overcome something to become good instead of being all good by themselves. This is why people don't like Hermione at Hogwarts, because she's the perfect student. We relate much more with Ron and with Harry because at least they are like us. Who can be like Hermione? Seriously. But anyway, it's really good stuff. And this is we're only at the halfway point. So I have high hopes for the rest of the story. Another series that I continue to enjoy so much is The Wheel of Time. This 4th episode is almost as good as the 3rd episode. The 3rd episode just completely blew me away. It was so good. The 4th episode was equally good. It is a very different take on The Wheel of Time than, for instance, Peter Jackson's adaptations of Tolkien's work. This is, you could say, almost like inspired by The Wheel of Time, but it is so different from the books. And of course, it's obvious why. They're never going to have 12 or 14 seasons. They're not going to do a season for each book. This will have a run of maybe 5 seasons. So they need to take a lot of shortcuts and simplify the story and in a certain way tell their own story. And maybe that's not a bad thing, because that makes it still worthwhile reading the books, because the books add so much to our understanding and it's so much fun to compare the two. The same is true for Netflix, what Netflix did with One Piece. I'm currently watching the 1st season of One Piece, which is about this boy who wants to become the king of pirates. I talked about it last week. And the anime series is also available online on Crunchyroll. So for each TV episode, I watch the anime episodes that are then kind of condensed in the TV episode. And it's brilliant. And they do such a good job translating the language of the Japanese anime into something that is much more universal in its appeal, but still stays very well true to the nature and the character of all these different kids in the series. It is one of my favorite series right now. Absolutely fantastic. And then now that I'm on the topic of storytelling, I didn't watch any movies. It was way too hot, even downstairs. It's not fun to watch TV when it's 30 degrees in. So I'm looking forward actually to when fall will kick in and temperatures will go down. That for me is the perfect time of the year to dive into stories and to read more books and to watch more movies. But there's also video games. Video games are also a very immersive type of storytelling. And so I started playing Starfield, which is this super high-profile game made by Bethesda Studios, the creators of Skyrim. If you've heard of that, if you're a gamer, you certainly have heard of that. They are known for very extensive adventure RPG games where you guide your character through a world where you have to talk to people, negotiate with them, and your choices impact the end result. And so the storylines can be different for each and every player. Starfield is a bit like Skyrim, but it's in space. And it is made with the latest technology. It looks absolutely gorgeous. You can fly from planet to planet. You have to make a lot of choices, which is always a bit hard, especially at the beginning of the game. Like in a lot of these games, you have to first kind of choose, what do you look like? And I can spend like 5 hours just tweaking the ears on my main character because I know I'm going to be stuck with that character for the rest of the game. So I want it to be good. But it's also a very grindy experience where like I want to experience a story. I don't want to spend my time giving myself 10 different haircuts and then having to ponder, which one do I like? And then it turns out you're going to be wearing a space helmet for the entire game. But what I liked about the narrative approach of Starfield is it starts with a story. So you're on this planet and you're in a mine. You have a job and you work for a lady who's running the mines, and they ask you to go into a very dangerous part of the mine to find an artifact. And the moment you touch the artifact, you have this very trippy, really weird out-of-body experience where it's as if the whole universe flows through you. And then when you come to your senses, you've been unconscious and you have to hand over that artifact to a guy who wants to buy it from you. And then there's an attack and you have to fight. And this is the first time you start to handle a gun. And it's only after that first introduction into the story that you get to define how you look like and what you look like and what your affiliation is and which planet you were born, if you have parents or not, etc. And all that will eventually, of course, have an impact on the way the story is told. And then once you come over that hurdle of modification of your main character, the rest of the story unfolds. It is vast. It is it's a bit scary in a sense that there are so many different choices, and I'm always like I always want to research like what is the best ship, what is the best character perk that I need, what is the best weapon or the best helmet, and but I've decided to take a different approach. I just go with the flow. I just play it the way I want to play it. And if there are consequences, I just trust the makers that the game is balanced enough to propel me through the story, even if I make less than optimal choices. And this is something that I love about video games, where every action is, to a certain extent, redeemable. Whereas if you're reading a novel, you may or may not agree with the choices that the main character makes, but you cannot impact it. You just have to kind of follow along, and sometimes that's very grating, especially if you're dealing with a character that is not very sympathetic. And some books do for some reason choose to have very unsympathetic main characters, and you're like, man, I really don't like this book. What you mean by that is I don't like the choices that this character takes. Well, in video games, you are the one who is guiding the ship, so you can fix your mistakes later on. It's going to be fun. I really enjoyed the ride, and I know that some of you are already playing Starfield as well. And on the Discord server with our gaming patrons, we have a number of our patrons who play video games as well. It's a lot of fun to talk about our experiences and also to exchange how different all these experiences are.
Catholics rock!
It's time for another visit to the Peculiar Bunch, where we talk about the Sunday Bible readings, and I try to illuminate them with some geeky examples.
Catholics can be a peculiar bunch. No meat on Friday.
Oh, meat? What do they eat? Light bulbs?
And each episode is going to end up in another podcast feed, which is, you can subscribe to it by searching for Gospel for Geeks.
Man, you guys got more crazy rules than Blockbuster Video.
One of the scariest moments in the first Harry Potter movie is not the confrontation between Harry Potter and Uncle Vernon. It's not the scary moment in the zoo where all of a sudden Harry finds himself face to face with a dangerous snake and the snake is talking to him. It's none of that. For me, the most scary moment in the first Harry Potter movie is his first confrontation with Snape. Snape is one of the teachers at Hogwarts, and Harry, as a new student, is in the class. And apparently, Snape knows exactly who he is and seems to have something against Harry from the get-go. Whereas for Harry, everything is new. He is so surprised that he was even asked to become a student there at Hogwarts. And now one of the most important teachers in the school seems to always want to humiliate Harry. And that's exactly what happens. Snape is constantly asking questions, rapid fire, and he singles out Harry Potter. And so, you are that Harry Potter. Why don't you know the answer to this question? And you feel for Harry. And then you've got Hermione in the background and, oh, I know the answer. But yeah, of course you know the answer, but poor Harry, why is he singled out like that? And why does Snape makes such an example of this poor orphan that we identify with. Why is Snape so evil? This is when you immediately start to dislike Snape, and of course that is done on purpose. The Rowling wants you to dislike Snape because of the whole role of Snape in the story. I won't spoil it if you haven't gone through the entire story yet. But this behavior where Snape singles out Harry and publicly humiliates him resonated with me because as a child I also had a similar experience, and I still remember it very vividly today. It was on my birthday, and I think I must have been, 9 or 10 years old. And when it was your birthday in school, you could hand out treats. And so at the time, it didn't have to be all very healthy. And nowadays, I think you're really, you risk your life if you hand out cake. No, it has to be like, I don't know, oranges or apples. And but when I was young, you could still hand out candy and be popular for one day at least, because normally I wasn't a popular kid in my class. But of course, when it's your birthday, everybody wants to have candy. So you make yourself feel very loved. And so I had candy with me, different types of candy. And at the beginning of the day, they would give me like a paper hat, that like a crown that had the number of years of my birthday, and I could hand out the candy. And so for a few minutes, we were able to eat the candy, and then it was back to work. And the day always started with mathematics. And so while I was studying the puzzles that we had to solve, I was constantly thinking of the leftover candy that was in my bag, in my school bag. And I secretly reached into that bag and took some candy and I put it in my mouth, hoping that nobody would notice. And unfortunately, that's when the teacher, who kind of reminded me a bit of McGonagall, or McGonagall reminded me of that teacher. She asked me a question, and I couldn't answer the question, not because I was stupid, but because I was chewing on that candy, and she became so furious. I remember that she brought me in front of the class. She took off my paper crown, and she said, "That's the end of your birthday. You've been breaking the rules, and there is there's no sweets, no eating during the lessons. You've been disobedient, and let this be a lesson for the entire class. Even if it's your birthday, I don't care. You don't break the rules." And then she sent me back to my place, to my seat. I felt so humiliated. The rush that I felt by being the good guy who was handing out candy, and the appreciation by all my classmates, which for me was very important because I didn't get that much appreciation from my fellow students. It was all gone, and I felt miserable and so humiliated. And almost out of revenge, I did it again an hour later. I was like, okay, I don't care anymore. I just want more candy. It's my birthday. And so I stuffed my mouth again with new candy. But I was so naive. Of course, the teacher was keeping an eye on me because she kind of suspected me to break the rules again. But this time she became so furious. She took me out of the class and she told the class, "Stay here, you work. I'm going to bring this guy to the headmaster." And the headmaster of the school was anything but a Dumbledore figure. He was this kind of imposing guy, a very tall man, and he had these like bushy eyebrows, and he always looked very stern. He would have these half glasses, these reading glasses that he would look over, and I was always a bit intimidated by the guy. But this time, I was being accused of a very serious crime. And so the teacher told the whole story to the headmaster, and then she asked the headmaster to bring me to my senses, which he then gladly obliged to do. And he took out my my report, but like the intermediate report, and he started to criticize my accomplishments. He said, "You have 6- for your handwriting, and it's horrible. You write like a baby." And he was very, very mean. And then he was criticizing the fact that I still made mistakes in, I don't know, grammar or something like that. Anyway, he said, and this is all because you're not listening to your teacher. You're being disobedient, and if you continue to do this, we're going to decide that you have to stay in that class, and then all your friends will move on to the next class, and you'll have an entire year to regret your choices. And I was petrified. I felt so not only humiliated, but I was genuinely scared to death that that would be the end of my school career. And I don't think that these teachers realized that literally traumatized me, because I all of a sudden I loved school, I loved reading, but the school didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like these adults, they can do anything they want. And I knew, of course, that it wasn't allowed to eat candy during class. But I felt, you know what? It's my birthday. I don't even like this type of candy. So in my mind, it was like it was a minor offense, and I get the capital punishment. It felt so unfair. And I was so afraid that for years I've been trying to overcompensate by always studying more than the other kids and making sure I had the best notes of the entire class, because I wanted to have straight A's everywhere. That's an American qualification. We have numbers of go from 0 to 10. So I wanted to have 9s and 10s on my report, and I did. I worked so hard, and I became the model student because I was motivated by fear, only by fear. Now I was thinking back of this when I was reading the Bible readings for the 23rd Sunday in ordinary time in the year A. I'm just mentioning this because this will be part of the podcast feed, and so maybe in subsequent years people may go back to this homily and listen to it when that Sunday comes up. So this is my commentary on the readings for the 23rd Sunday through the year of ordinary time, and it's year A, liturgical year A. We're reading from the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew, as a gospel writer, was writing his version of the gospel for a predominantly Jewish audience. And many of them had joined these early Christian communities and were trying to get things going. And so in this part of his gospel, Matthew gathers a number of things that Jesus said that these early Christian communities could apply to the way in which they would deal with things and problems and how they would deal with one another. And this was, I think, based on a very realistic assessment that not everything was rose-colored in those early Christian communities. There was also, from time to time, discord, and people had different opinions, and people came from different backgrounds as well. Some of them had been taught the Jewish religion for their entire life, and other people were from a totally pagan background, and so for them, a lot of the things that were totally obvious to the Jewish members, formerly Jewish members of that community, were like outlandish and strange and whatnot. So in this particular gospel that we read on this Sunday, Matthew reminds the reader of something that Jesus said about what do you do with people that break the rules, with dissidents, people that make mistakes that not only hurt themselves, but also threaten to hurt the community. How do you deal with that? And he writes down that Jesus says that there are, of course, different ways to approach someone who has broken the rules. But the first step should be to have a face-to-face, one-on-one conversation. And Jesus continues and specifies and shows us why it's so important to start with that. Because if that works, if you too can sort things out and you help your brother or your sister to see that actually he or she did something wrong, you have gained a brother and a sister. The community is not broken. So that is the aim. That is the reason. And it's much more likely to sort things out between two people than if you start on the other side, where you start with like publicly denouncing someone. This is what, unfortunately, is kind of the standard nowadays in our social media communication, where we are so quick to judge one another and to do it publicly. This is why people that are in politics are often suffering so much, or if they're not suffering, sometimes they become so harsh and they strike. They are just as hard hitting as their critics because they feel like, well, if I hit first, then the other one cannot hurt me. There's a lot of this hardening of hearts that is happening in the world in which we live. And unfortunately, the fact that you can post anything anonymously on social media for the world to see is amplifying that behavior. And our leaders don't always give the right example in this. But it is permeating our culture everywhere on the planet, and not in a positive way. I think this is one of the reasons that, according to new research, a lot of younger people on the internet are going back to closed communities and to almost one-on-one communication. When we grew up with social media, our desire was to reach a worldwide audience. We wanted to have millions of followers and to be followed and adored by as many fans as possible. So we would curate what we post in order to game the algorithm so that we could have the widest reach. However, we soon started to realize that there is also a price that we pay for that exposure. And that is, there may be a lot of people that don't like us or that are jealous of the life that we project. It's not always the life that we live that we put on the internet, but it's what we project. And sometimes people will be extremely mean just because they can. And that does actually cause damage and can really hurt your feelings of self-worth, especially if you already struggle with your sense of worth in the rest of your life. And so we know that extensive use of social media has, in general, a negative impact on people. And I don't think it's by accident that nowadays the trend becomes for younger people to step away from that huge exposure, which makes you extremely vulnerable as well, and to try to find like-minded people where you can be yourself and where you can be safe. In a certain way, this is also what we try to do with our Patreon community. There's a reason that you can only join the Discord server if you are a patron, because we want that to be a safe place. So we don't want to open it up to just anyone, because it can make it. You can expose the community to a lot of criticism and bad behavior, and you don't want to be a police officer all the time there. You want to have like a natural sense of safety and where people can just be themselves and there can be a good atmosphere. And thankfully, there is a very good atmosphere on the Discord server. So the way that Jesus proposes us to approach these dissidents is that if someone opts to not listen, then the next step is maybe find one or two wise people and have a slightly wider conversation where it's not just my word against your word. No, listen to these other people. They see the same thing. Can we talk about this? It's still a very open conversation. It's not judgmental, but it is, hey, this is not just something that irks me. This is, as a community, we have problems with this. And maybe that works. Maybe that works. And if that still doesn't work, then you can bring it to the rest of the community, because someone who is damaging to the community, the rest of the people have a right to be protected and to be also aware of the fact that there is someone in their midst who may be hurting his brothers and sisters. And so the church may actually, in the person of, for instance, a bishop, may say, hey, this is not good behavior. This has to change. And so it's much more public already. And then when that person still doesn't want to listen, then, only then, you can say publicly, that person is no longer with us. That person, by his or her behavior, has separated herself or himself from the community. And so we consider them no longer as a Christian. That's only the ultimate step. And then Jesus follows up with hold on, this is not everything I have to tell you. Let me show you what the ideal is. I'm not just going to... building up a church is not just about how to deal with people that you don't like or that don't agree with you. Now, ultimately, what it is about is you have to be together. When 2 or 3 people are gathered in my name, Jesus says immediately afterwards, then it's impossible for God to resist their request. You can ask anything you want and God will listen because God wants us to be united. So it's an appeal to these early Christian communities to try to be as united as possible. But in case it doesn't work, then maybe start small instead of publicly denouncing someone. And I think there's a lot of common sense in that advice. It's charitable, of course, but it's also, this is the way it works. If someone attacks you in public, it doesn't help you. I was traumatized by the way in which these 2 teachers treated me as a child, and it didn't have a good, well, you may say, well, at least you became a good student, but I think that there are other methods to stimulate someone to be a good student, and this was not a good way. Always begin small. Now, how did this story end? Years and years later, I got an invitation to go to a reunion on the primary school, and all the former teachers who are now retired would be there too. And in the lead up to that reunion, I couldn't stop thinking about seeing that teacher again and to tell Mrs. McGonagall what her behavior on that particular day, which happened to be my birthday, actually caused me in terms of trauma and how terrible she made my life ever since. And I was really riled up, and I was already, I don't know, in my 30s. And I was like, what am I going to say? I need to tell her. She needs to be aware of what she did. And then I entered the school, and all these former students are there in the main hallway of the school. And I see her immediately. I recognize her. She hasn't changed a bit. So this is, 25 years later, 30 years later. But she still looks the same. She's got the same curly hair, and she looks older. But so, and then I immediately decide, this is a bad idea. I'm not going to confront her. But what then? And I decided to just walk up to her and to start a conversation, and she didn't recognize me at all. And then I tried to help her. I tried to trigger her memory. I said, do you remember that one day that there was this kid, and it was his birthday, and he had smuggled in candy, or he had handed out candy, and then he was eating from the candy, and you sent him to the headmaster? And she looked at me with a blank stare, and she said, I honestly don't remember. This may have happened, and it probably has happened multiple times. And yeah, I was a little bit strict as a teacher, but I still really tried to be a good teacher, and I was always concerned, and I loved the work that I did. And the way she was talking about it, it totally didn't register at all. And then that was the moment that I could let go. I had this one-on-one conversation, and I could tell as an adult that all of a sudden, it was like, well, she probably was, at the time, she must have been in her 20s. Just a few years of experience. She's human also. Maybe she made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't the best way to treat students, but that's not who she is. She is not just that one mistake that she made. No, she's someone who actually has given her life to teach children and to help them. And the only thing that I focus on is that one mistake that she made that hurt me so much. Come on. And so it was actually a very healing encounter and a very good thing. So the reason that I tell this story is to give you an example of actually that one-on-one approach is the best way. And I kind of regret that it took me 30 years to actually have that conversation with that teacher.
When did you become an expert in thermonuclear astrophysics?
Last night. The packet. The extraction theory papers. Am I the only one who did the reading?
I read a very cool book called Yellowface, written by R.F. Kuang. She also wrote, I think, a novel called Babylon, which has been in the top 10 charts for months. That's a very, very thick book. It takes forever. So this was much more concise as a book. And I loved it because it tells a story about a writer, and I've always had a certain sympathy for writers, and I've written one book myself, and I still kind of hope that one day I'll write another book. But this is written from the perspective of a writer who has a friend, another female writer, who is super popular, and she's made a very swift career, and she's a bit jealous of that friend, because her friend is from Asian descent, and she's been discovered very early on, and she has a fantastic career as a writer, whereas she, as a writer herself, has to go from door to door. Nobody wants to publish her books, and even if she ultimately gets published, it is not received very well, and she doesn't get anything back for the investment that she put into her books. And then she is she's still in touch with this friend, and her friend is talking about a novel that she's writing about the way in which Chinese slaves were treated during the war, or something like that. Anyway, and she knows that's probably going to be another bestseller. And to celebrate a contract that she closes for the publication and even the film rights for that manuscript, her friend chokes on a pancake. They both have been drinking too much, and then she chokes on a pancake that they're making in the middle of the night, and she dies. And then she decides to do something that she probably will regret for the rest of her life. She nicks the manuscript, because nobody knows about this book. The contract didn't specify what book it was that she was writing. So nobody knew that the novel was almost finished. And then she starts to go over it and to improve it, because it's just a first draft. And so she spends all her time for about a year to make that book publishable and to make it better. And in many ways, she does really improve on the original story. And then she decides to publish it under her own name. And she has had a little bit of exposure right after the death of this author, because she was there when it happened. And so a lot of people know her. And then she comes out with this novel that she publishes under her own name. And people say, oh, it's so incredibly good. And she hits all the bestseller lists, and she gets a movie deal as well. But with all the fame also comes the criticism, and people start attacking her for being racially insensitive, because she's writing about these Chinese history, but she isn't. She's not from Asian descent at all, so it's cultural appropriation. And then in the novel, she's defending herself, and you go with her through that entire story. But then it gets more and more harrowing, because there are several moments where what she did actually is almost coming out, and she is about to be discovered. And then she finds ways to avert that danger, but it becomes more and more tense. And then things happen, which I won't go into. You'll have to read the book for yourself, that are just really, really strange. And the whole book, the whole story, is about this inner conflict to see how she has justified something to herself, like, I'm doing this because this book needs to be out there, and it wasn't ready for publication. So she's rationalizing what she did, but she also feels a bit guilty there. Her conscience is constantly working in the background, and the way she deals with that is the core of this book. It was very, very interesting, a very good read, and also gives you a bit of an insight into the world of writers today, and how they use social media to get the word out, and how it works with, and all that, of course, is based on the actual experience of Ms. Kwong, and she, as a writer, is probably going through a lot of the things that she describes here in this fictional persona. Fascinating book, really, really fun read. It's called Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. So, a quick look into the kitchen. I have a new toaster, and it is amazing. It's a spaceship. Inge gave me this tip, and she had bought this toaster. Inge is our community manager, and she had this toaster, and she showed it on a video that she sent me, where the bread, because I had a very cheap toaster. The problem is it was so small that a lot of the sandwich slices that we have in the Netherlands were too big, so they would only like heat up 2/3 of the sandwich, and it was bothering me a lot because I'm actually oftentimes toasting my bread. I just like that. It's much better than just plain bread. So this toaster actually is much bigger. And you enter the bread, you press a button, and then it slowly descends. There's a motorized mechanism inside, and it is so cool. You can also put like things like bagels in it or like pretzels, and it fits. It adjusts to the size of the bread you put in it. So I saw this 2 weeks ago, actually when I was still on vacation in France, in Brittany, and I saw that there was a deal where you could get it for half the price. And these are not cheap. These are like more than 100 euros. So I ordered it immediately without thinking. I was like, that is the bargain of the century. That's never coming back. And I've had my eye on this toaster for a long time. So I'm just going to do it. And so I tried it out. And I was looking at the way it was heating up. And I saw that it was only the heating rods on the inside were getting warm, and the outside was just glowing a little bit, but almost looked at it as if it wasn't functioning well. And then, of course, you get the big thing. I ordered this over the internet. So am I going to send this back? But on the other hand, it is still working. I mean, it does toast my bread, but it feels like it's broken. Shouldn't it be old like that? And so I went on this detective quest of figuring out, is this normal behavior or is this a broken unit, and should I send it back? It's not an easy process to send it back. You have to repackage it. Usually you have to pay the fees of transportation. It may actually take a long time. And what if they're going to say that it's actually not broken? This is supposed to be like this. And ultimately, I went to YouTube and I looked at every review of the device, and I found this one demonstration online where you get a glimpse of what's happening on the inside of the machine while it is toasting, and lo and behold, it's the same thing as my toaster did. It had, the inside was like burning hot, and the outside was just glowing a little bit. Now, the reason that I was confused was that Inge took a photo of her toaster, and it was glowing on both sides, and much more than my toaster did. So I was like, yeah, maybe it's broken. But then when I saw it on that other video, and the guy showed this is the end result, and it looked like perfectly toasted bread. So I ended up buying some white bread, and I toasted it because I was like, well, maybe this is, I don't know, maybe it's not faulty. And it came out perfectly toasted on both sides, equally brown on both sides, and that's where I just accept it. Even if it's broken, it's good enough for me. It does the job. My bread is now well toasted, so I'm just going to keep it up. And I'm so glad that I didn't have to go through the whole process of sending it back. It's always too late when I realize that, yes, ordering online can save you money, but if something is malfunctioning, it's so much hassle. It's one of the reasons that I'm very picky as to where I order my stuff, because if it's just this tiny little web shop somewhere in Europe, you don't know. It's not guaranteed that they're going to answer your emails when you call. So I usually go with the big companies, which then, of course, is also supporting just Amazon. Is that good? I don't know. It's better just look around for deals like that in my vicinity, and just have a store to go to. There's value in that as well.
We are on the cutting edge of technology.
Wow. Well, what does that mean?
Just plug it in. It's going to say, hey, I see you plugged in a new device, and it's going to load in the appropriate drivers. You'll notice that this scanner build,
Well, all your technology stuff, it just ends in disaster.
But there is one more thing.
As of today, the date I'm recording this on Sunday, it's only 2 days, and then we're going to see the iPhone 15. Oh, I can't wait. I'm so curious. I hope it's not going to be too expensive. There are rumors that the Pro version, which is probably the one that I would like to have, is going to be even more expensive than the iPhone 14 Pro, which was already super expensive. I am glad that apparently this new iPhone has rounded corners. That's the one thing I did not like at all of these new iPhones. When I was in the US last year, Rob showed me his iPhone 14. It was the iPhone 14 Pro Max. It felt so heavy, but especially because of these sharp edges, it was uncomfortable to hold. I really like the rounded corners of the iPhone 6 and some of the older iPhones. So I'm glad that they are going back to a slightly more, I don't know, like a phone that feels better in the hand. But anyway, there's nothing more that I can say about the iPhone 15. Next week, of course, I'll talk about it at length. But what I do want to talk about is just it's kind of a short a tip that if you like watching me live and chat and hang out, I, of course, sometimes stream my podcasts. I also, from time to time, stream my Lego sessions. I really need to get back to that. The reason that haven't been doing much Lego building is, again, just the summer temperatures. It's so scorchingly hot upstairs that it's not fun to stream. But I've also built a new streaming set around my Xbox, and it turns out I can now stream games, and I can use a webcam to insert myself in the picture. So whenever I'm playing Starfield, for instance, I can actually stream this on Twitch. So if you're currently watching this on Twitch, you may want to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, because I'm looking forward to actually streaming some of my gaming sessions. It's a different dynamic, of course, than when I'm just sitting in front of my laptop and chatting, and because when I'm playing a video game, obviously I'll also have to concentrate on the game itself. But I still think it's an opportunity to connect with a part of my audience that really likes me to play video games. So if you go to twitch.tv, just look for Father Roderick and make sure to subscribe to that channel so you'll get notified whenever I go live. I'm not going to stream that on YouTube or on Facebook because different audiences there, but I will be streaming that on twitch.tv. And with that, it is time to wrap things up. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. I hope you enjoyed this show. It's a little bit on the long side, but if you hear this, you are listening to the premium version of the show anyway, so you just get more value. I'm still getting used to this new narrative format, but I'm enjoying it, and I hope that my listeners to the public feed actually also enjoy these stories that I tell. I try to do a good job, and hopefully I'll get better at it if I'm practicing this every week. Thanks again so much for your support. Also for the feedback that some of you gave on the passing of my father. I really appreciate the sometimes very personal feedback that I got. I try to be just very transparent about how I feel and what it does to me and the memories that I have. I was wondering, should I even talk about it? But then I'm thinking, this is just part of my life, and in many ways, part of what I do is sharing my life with you, but it turned out to be quite relatable to some of you. So thank you so much for your own kindness and empathy in the situation. We'll talk soon. Have a great week, and God bless.